You're standing on a mountain plateau in Central Asia. It's roughly 500 BC. The air is thin, the wind is brutal, and a group of mourners is gathered around a wooden bowl filled with glowing stones. Someone drops dried plant material onto those stones. Smoke rises, thick and sweet, and the mourners lean in and breathe it in on purpose. This isn't the oldest human habit we're going to talk about today. It isn't even close. But it's the oldest one we can actually prove with hard chemistry. And that distinction matters more than you'd think. Because here's the thing nobody tells you about marijuana's history. Humans grew this plant, harvested it, and built entire economies around it for thousands of years before anyone has solid evidence they ever got high from it on purpose. The rope came first. The high came later. And figuring out exactly when that changeover happened has turned into one of the strangest detective stories in modern archaeology. Let's start with the plant itself, because the timeline here is genuinely disorienting. Cannabis isn't a few thousand years old. According to a pollen study analyzing plant fossils across Asia, the species that would eventually become marijuana evolved roughly 28 million years ago on the eastern Tibetan plateau. For context, that's before the Himalayas finished rising to their current height, before most of the animals you'd recognize today existed, and almost 28 million years before a single human being would ever exist to smoke it. For nearly the entirety of that span, cannabis was just a wild plant doing wild plant things, spreading slowly across Central Asia, completely indifferent to the species that would one day build a multi-billion-dollar industry around it. Humans enter this story extremely late by comparison, and even then, not for the reason you'd assume. A major genetic study published in 2021 sequenced cannabis DNA from around the world and traced domestication back roughly 12,000 years to early farmers in what's now northwest China. And here's the part that should genuinely surprise you. Those early farmers almost certainly weren't growing it to get high. The oldest cultivated strains show genetic signatures closer to modern hemp than to anything you'd want to smoke. China's Yangshao culture, thriving between 5000 and 3000 BC, built part of their entire material economy around this plant, weaving hemp fiber into cloth, pressing the seeds for oil, using the leftover cake to feed livestock. This was infrastructure. This was rope and fabric and lamp fuel. Ancient Chinese legend even credits a mythical emperor named Shen Nung, supposedly ruling around 2737 BC, with cataloging cannabis as medicine. Though like most origin stories attached to legendary rulers, that one is almost certainly folklore layered onto a real plant rather than a documented historical event. For roughly 10,000 years, in other words, humans and cannabis had a working relationship that looked nothing like what you're picturing right now. So when did that change? This is where the story gets genuinely tricky, because for decades, archaeologists thought they already had the answer, and it turns out they were wrong in a really instructive way. Researchers had proposed ritual cannabis burning at Central Asian sites dating back as far as 5,000 years, based on burnt plant remains found near ceremonial contexts. It seemed to close the case. Then newer chemical analysis of those exact same plant remains told a different story. The strains being burned at those older sites had low levels of FEC, the compound actually responsible for getting you high. People may well have been burning cannabis that far back, but chemically, it probably wasn't doing much to their minds beyond what any burning plant matter might do. Wrong plant, right ballpark. This is the marijuana history equivalent of digging up a legend and finding out the details were almost right, just several centuries premature. The real breakthrough, the discovery that finally nailed down a date scientists could stand behind, didn't come until 2019. A team led by archaeologists Yang Yimin and Ren Meng examined 10 wooden bowls recovered from the Jirsankal Cemetery, a 2,500-year-old burial site high in the Pamir Mountains of what's now western China. Using new residue testing techniques, they identified a clear chemical signature of cannabis, and critically, cannabis with unusually high content burned inside those bowls during funeral ceremonies dated to around 500 BC. This wasn't wild hemp being used for its fiber. This was the good stuff, deliberately selected, deliberately burned, deliberately inhaled by mourners at a funeral. It's currently the earliest scientifically confirmed evidence anywhere on Earth of humans intentionally smoking cannabis specifically to get high. Here's where the story does something you don't often get in ancient history. It hands a 2,000-year-old eyewitness account a full vindication. Around 440 BC, the Greek historian Herodotus wrote about the Scythians, nomadic people ranging across the Eurasian steppe from Siberia to Eastern Europe, describing how they built small tents, heated stones inside them, and threw hemp seeds onto those stones to inhale the resulting vapor. At which point, in his words, they shouted for joy. For centuries, this got filed away as classic ancient historian exaggeration, the kind of thing you assume got embellished somewhere between the steppe and the page. Then archaeologists started actually excavating Scythian burial mounds and found exactly what Herodotus described: bronze braziers, heated stones, hemp residue. He wasn't exaggerating anything. If anything, he undersold it. This might be one of the only cases in ancient history where the wild-sounding claim in the primary source turned out to be the conservative version of what actually happened. Why does the timing work out this way? Plant domesticated for rope and oil around 12,000 years ago, but psychoactive smoking not confirmed until roughly 2,500 years ago. Genetics gives us a real answer here, not just speculation. That same 2021 domestication study found evidence that cannabis populations split into distinct genetic lineages, some drifting toward the fiber and seed traits early farmers wanted, others retaining or amplifying the compounds responsible for getting you high. Wild cannabis naturally varies in potency, and it looks like early cultivation, entirely by accident at first, gradually sorted plants into what we'd now recognize as separate categories: industrial hemp on one branch, drug-type cannabis on the other. Nobody in Neolithic China was running a controlled breeding experiment for psychoactive strength. They were farming a useful plant, and somewhere in that farming, some populations of it just happened to drift toward stronger and stronger highs, the same way a lot of domestication stories go. Humans select for one trait on purpose and stumble into a completely different one by accident. And this is where the biology actually gets interesting, because your brain was already prepared for this moment long before any human ever selected a stronger strain. Every human being alive has an endocannabinoid system, a network of receptors that regulate mood, memory, appetite, and pain, and those receptors didn't evolve because of cannabis. They evolved for entirely unrelated reasons tied to the body's own internal chemistry. But because they exist, the first time a human brain encountered a strong enough dose of the plant's psychoactive compounds, that brain wasn't confused. The lock was already sitting there, fully formed, waiting for a key nobody had handed it yet. Cannabis didn't rewire the human brain to get us high. It just happened to fit a system that was already built for something else entirely, which might explain why, once humans finally landed on a strain potent enough to notice, the behavior spread so fast and stuck around so completely. From that Pamir Plateau funeral onward, the story accelerates the way these stories always do. Cannabis moved along the same Silk Road networks carrying silk, paper, and eventually gunpowder, reaching South Asia, the Middle East, and eventually Europe over the following centuries, sometimes as medicine, sometimes as textile, sometimes, increasingly, as the thing those Scythian tents were built for in the first place. The industrial and psychoactive versions of this one plant kept traveling together and separately for thousands of years, one half quietly becoming rope, canvas, and paper, the other half becoming ritual, medicine, and eventually one of the most globally consumed recreational substances on Earth before large parts of the 20th century tried, mostly unsuccessfully, to legislate that second half out of existence entirely.